No, I mean, listen, nuclear waste has never hurt a single person, place, or thing in all of human history. So the idea that nuclear waste is dangerous is insane. But once again, if your five closest friends and everyone you know always said nuclear waste is the most hazardous thing on planet Earth, I can't fault you for believing that. But yeah, it's just not true.
So, man, I'm so excited to have you here. I am confident this is going to be an amazing conversation and podcast. I think we met for the first time at the Foresight conference, and I knew in one sentence that when you were giving your talk that it's like, I got to get this guy on the podcast. I want everybody to hear him. Do you have any inkling what that sentence was?
Ooh, probably something about more meltdowns the merrier.
Yeah, I think you were like, we need more nuclear meltdowns, not less. And I was like, oh, this man has an interesting point of view that I would like to explore. Bring it on.
Yeah, well, we better explain the context of that at some point before we scare too much of your audience away. But I'm sure we'll get to it soon enough.
Let's start there, man. Why do we need more nuclear meltdowns?
Well, the basic theory there is that there's a misunderstanding. People associate meltdowns with hazard, but it's actually not the meltdown itself that creates hazard. It's the movement of radionuclides. It's the creation of material that's adverse to human health into an area where humans would come in contact to it with. The actual melting isn't a problem. So now that's an important distinction because a lot of technologists use this concept around meltdown or meltdown proof to demonstrate value in a different strategy that often sacrifices many other qualities that you would want in your system, including simplicity and reduction of accidents or anything. It's just, if you focus on the meltdown, which isn't really the right problem to solve, and you just use it as a proxy for your problem, sometimes you end up solving the wrong problem. So that's one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is that if you don't want people to be afraid of nuclear, you can't brand something that happens infrequently as catastrophic, or if it's already perceived as catastrophic, you should make it happen more frequently and show people that it's not a hazard. So, for instance, it's like every time that you light a candle, you're technically creating a fire, but you're not creating a hazard. But it does get people a little more confident with the concept of, oh, not all fire means that you're burning alive in a building. So exposure to something that has a negative connotation to show other sides of it helps reduce like the inherent cultural fear with that event. And so that's more of we need more meltdowns, not less. And also, it gets people's ears and eyes lit up to listen to the rest of what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're so good at some of these like hooks or just like spicy takes that people are like, whoa. I'm gonna need you to explain that because there's so much of this insane sort of like totally counterfactual, counterintuitive, just like insane comparisons in nuclear in particular that I think you're good at sort of laying out for people. I think another one that I've heard you talk about in some of your other speeches is exactly what you're talking about. Like, we are so afraid of nuclear because of how it's talked about and how it's regulated in particular, that like the signals that the regulations give us make us so much more fearful than is like warranted by the physical reality of these things.
Right. And that's not an accident. That's actually by design. And so you see this actually crop up in a lot of different industries. And so what happened in the nuclear industry, where the incumbents at the time used something called regulatory capture to create a moat around themselves. And then over time, as their business evolved, they actually benefited from the fear of nuclear to create more regulatory moats. And so a lot of the fear from around nuclear doesn't come from environmentalists making stuff up. It doesn't come from the oil industry trying to be more competitive. It comes from the old nuclear industry itself that over time morphed from a business model of selling power plants to selling fear. So they could sell safety systems. They could sell add-ons to the existing plants, which became 10 times as profitable as the original plant itself.
Wow. I've never heard that before. That is wild. I was just listening to Mark Andreessen talk about the two-way nature of regulatory capture, which I think is really interesting, right? Like,
Oh,
people
where was he
normally,
doing this? I love listening to him. What was the
it was a
platform?
kind of obscure podcast. I can send it to you. It was like an acronym. It was with a journalist and an academic, but it was like a 2 hour long podcast. It was pretty recently. And he talked about, like, you normally think of it as people sort of using the laws, like businesses using the existing, like getting the government to pass the laws, but there's also the government capturing the businesses to continue to enforce the laws. It was a pretty interesting. He's like, it's a two-way feedback loop. Like, most people don't recognize that.
Yeah, I mean, it's what I think is even more interesting is his voice, but then also other voices coming from this, like the Silicon Valley tech, or maybe even just engineering community, really drawing a different, like, understanding of what regulations and even industry is, just like from a totally different perspective that hasn't been done before by economists or social scientists. So it is very cool to see, especially such like a hardcore engineer as Andreessen, like, give us his take on it. That is cool.
So, as a sort of an operator in the nuclear space, like, do you find regulation to be the biggest hurdle, the biggest impediment to progress for the industry as a whole?
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, regulation was used as a tool specifically to prevent progress. It was designed that way. And in some that's in the nuclear industry, but in some other industries, it's also designed that way. And sometimes, that's the explicit intent. And then sometimes it's just like a confluence of incentives that drives things that way. But yeah, no doubt. And I'm not saying, hey, throw away all regulations, but the way that these regulations were designed was specifically to inhibit progress. Yeah.
Of new nuclear companies.
Yeah. New nuclear installations, new nuclear companies. Yeah. I mean, the industry essentially cannibalizes its own assets in a very, like, rent-seeking behavior to extract as much value, not from the production of energy, but from, like, the infrastructure itself.
It was such a shame. So how do you navigate that as one of the startups who's kind of, like, targeted and roadblocked by old nuclear, by existing regulations, by regulatory bodies,
and by new nuclear too? A lot of new nuclear too. A lot of new nuclear companies, they might think they have the intent to build, but their actions belie that truth. Instead, rather, they'd almost never build, but just have forever science projects. And the people themselves would be happy with forever science projects. And I mean, you see this in other areas too. All sorts of scientific endeavors that, like, have like a pseudo commercial lens, but are really driven off of government grants and government money. But a lot of the new nuclear companies are that. If you were to, like, say, hey, would you rather have something actually built, and, like, you personally be involved in something that's actually built, or work on your favorite technology, 90% of them would choose, I'd rather work on my favorite technology and never actually see anything built.
Interesting. So what's the playbook when, you're dealing when the biggest risk in your company is regulatory?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's like part of my entrepreneurial principles, is to always solve the right problem. Identify what your actual problem is, not your proximate problem, your root problem, and then design a system to solve that problem. And so, regulatory competence and regulatory strategy is a huge part of my company, Last Energy, like our, like, institutional prowess. And we have essentially hedged our regulatory risk by working in multiple jurisdictions. We're one of the few companies that does that. So that's, a core part of the strategy. But also, working with regulators. I mean, I've spent the last 5 years getting to know regulators and meeting with them, hundreds of them across dozens of countries, and having amazing conversations. I mean, a lot of the individuals at these regulatory bodies are incredible people, and I love talking to them, and they're super brilliant and smart and have amazing perspectives and want to do good. My problem is mostly with, like, the institutions themselves and how they're set up, that often handicap, they shackle their own employees' motivation to, like, fulfill the stated objective of the regulator, but not the way that these bodies were actually constructed.
Interesting. So you, how global is sort of the approach for Last Energy? Like, are you hoping to work in the U.S.? Is that sort of or is that not possible with the existing regulations?
Well, we work through the U.S. and we definitely are subject to different regulatory bodies in the U.S. as well, especially as it comes to like export control. So like we work very closely with the NNSA on the export of nuclear intellectual property as governed under, Regulation Part 810, Appendix A, which has like a fast-tracked process to actually do this if you work with a set of whitelisted countries. So, we do work with U.S. regulators, state commerce as well. But then when it comes to nuclear licensing of facilities, of ground installations, there's a different set of regulators which is like, it's the sovereign right of any given country to regulate the physical property, that's nuclear related on their country. And so they have their own regulatory bodies that we just work a lot more closely with. I'd say the U.S. market for us is probably a half decade or decade out. And there would have to be just some serious changes. And, if other companies think they can pave the path here, great. We'll follow in their footsteps here while we focus on blazing the trail abroad.
Interesting. All right. I want to come back and spend a lot of time on Last Energy. But let's I'm curious, like, who are you? Like, what kind of background does it take to be a guy who builds nuclear power plants?
Well, I'm going to say something a little caustic here, maybe.
Not for the last time, I'm sure. Bring it on.
Yeah, a little hot take. I'd say the background that it takes to design the nuclear power plants is probably a nuclear engineer, which I'm not. The background that it takes to build a nuclear power plant is probably anything but a nuclear engineer.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
I mean, listen, like in this country, it's pretty clear we haven't, built any nuclear installation. I mean, they're building some stuff. Vogtle's finally coming to a conclusion, but half the people that started that project are dead at this point by the time it's going to get finished. So when it comes to like nuclear building experience, the nuclear industry is really quite limited there. I mean, I come from a mechanical engineering background, and I built products and I built frontier tech. My first startup was a drone business, and so it had all, the various disciplines, electrical controls, in many cases, much more complicated disciplines, autonomous controls, certainly mechanical and structural and aerodynamics. I mean, there's a lot to it. And then manufacturing, right? And so, and then there's also a regulatory component to that too. So that was a lot of the background that I had in my previous startup that I think helped inform many of the ways that I go about building this one.
And I reading between the lines of some of your other appearances, it sounds like sort of the entrepreneurial zeal that you bring from your Silicon Valley operating background is thin on the ground in the nuclear industry.
I'd say that there's a lot of entrepreneurial zeal, just not a lot of entrepreneurial experience. So most of the entrepreneurs in the nuclear sector are nuclear PhDs or nuclear professors, and don't have a previous startup under their belt. And maybe that is one of my advantages here.
Yeah, I mean, the talk I was watching this morning, you were pounding the podium like faster, no excuses. Stop yelling, stop waiting for patient capital and become an impatient operator. Like, I'm paraphrasing, but it was castigating a room full of supposedly, nuclear entrepreneurs for just not bucking up and being operators.
I know it's crazy. And it's like, so I was giving this talk, it was a pretty awesome panel. It was like, Bill Magwood, who is like the head of the nuclear part of the OECD. Bill Gates was on this panel. And then there's this professor, I won't name his name, but it's a Berkeley professor that has a nuclear startup. And his one advice to the audience was, take things slow, go slow and steady in your nuclear entrepreneurship. He literally said those words. I almost couldn't believe it. And then so in my, I rewrote my speech on the fly to just totally take him down. I mean, like in a very nice way. And I want to be respectful as well, but just like from a philosophy perspective, I just thought he was sending totally the wrong message. Like, I couldn't believe it. Like, if I were any of his investors, I would have pulled out in that exact minute. I could not believe it.
Yeah, I don't think anybody's issue with the nuclear space is that it's moving too quickly. Though I understand if you most of the relationship you have with that word is fear-based, then you're forced to move slow for a bunch of reasons, you know.
Yeah, it's part of your business model sometimes too. I mean, yeah, with this company, you know, they essentially hype up the fear around nuclear waste so they can sell a nuclear waste solution. It's like ridiculous.
Okay. So what was the transition between drones and building nuclear?
Well, I started a research institute called the Energy Impact Center, which was just my own money and a vehicle for me to hire people and do business out of, and you know, start really just, you know, taking a first principles look at climate and energy. And, you know, very quickly realized nuclear was misunderstood, totally under leveraged, and, you know, just based on like a raw physics basis should be like the core pillar of our energy transition. It just made sense. And what didn't make sense was everyone's reason why we didn't have more nuclear. Everyone just kept falling back to the same thing that you hear growing up, or that you hear by, you know, I always like to say, like, I almost can't fault people when, like, everyone just, like, the sum of people's knowledge on any given subject is usually what their 5 closest friends around them say on that, you know? So it's, you almost can't fault people if most of culture has been saying the same thing over and over again, for that not to re-question that assumption. But in many cases, they're still dead wrong.
Yeah, I mean, that's hopefully we're fighting fire with this podcast, you know, like trying to replace some of those narratives. Well,
I think what's funny is I think even the people who come away from this podcast like agreeing, it's not necessarily going to be like the merits of the argument that they agree with. It's going to mostly be they're also contrarians, and they're like latching onto something that like kind of makes sense, and, you know, or seemingly makes sense, I should say. It definitely does make sense, but to them it seems that it makes sense. And that has a contrarian spin to it, and they're just going to relate to that and maybe parrot what I'm saying, but they still probably won't have like a fundamental like, source material research to back it up. But that's okay. Like, I'll take them.
Well, it's interesting how many times the shallow opinion precedes the deep research, right? Like you form an opinion and then go do the work to like, wait, let me find out if that's as true as I want it to be, right?
Totally. It's one of the cognitive biases. I think that's like one of the, in the category of like selection bias. You only, like, you seek facts, even without realizing, that support the thesis that you already have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So let's plant the thesis that nuclear is good, and work backwards.
I think most people at this point actually do intuit that, and over time, it's just going to get more and more.
Yeah, it wasn't until doing research on you for this conversation that I realized that Bret Kugelmass, guy who started Last Energy, is also Bret Kugelmass, guy who started Titans of Nuclear podcast, which is like something I've been listening to for a while now, as I've tried to kind of understand, tried to build rationale for my hopeful, optimistic opinion that nuclear is amazing.
That's cool. I had a similar experience with Joe Rogan. When I heard the first podcast with him, I didn't realize that was the same like Fear Factor guy, the same comedian guy. And then it took me like, it took a little while for me to like put all that together.
Yeah. That guy looks familiar. What's going on here? Yeah. So quick, shout out for your podcast, which is 400 episodes or so over the last 4 years, which is crazy output. Interviews a ton of amazing people in that space, which I love, like all over the map too, not just like CEOs and founders, but operators and regulators. And it's a really interesting sort of overview of the space.
The shout out goes to my team, Olivia, who's been managing the podcast for the last few years. Now Sarah is taking it over. They just do a tremendous job.
That's awesome.
And then I should also mention the other podcast that we also run, which we don't tie any of these brands together, which maybe is where some of the confusion comes from. But it's called Energy Impact. So there's another 100 episodes there that speaks about energy issues in a context more broad than just nuclear.
Nice. How did the podcast figure into the founding of your company? I think it was about 2 years before that you started Titans of Nuclear, and you were like doing this sort of research process. But how did that? What sort of role did it play?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn from the best. I wanted to have like easy access to all facets of the industry. And so the podcast, I didn't know this at first, but I tested a few things, and the podcast ended up being a channel that enabled that reduced the, I think of it in terms of like customer acquisition cost. Obviously, these aren't really customers, but let's say like stakeholder relationship cost. Any given relationship that you want to create from cold outreach has a real cost to your time and effort. And if you want to totally maximize those numbers of relationships that you develop given a limited resource environment, you have to optimize along those parameters. And so the podcast was simply an optimization.
Interesting. So when talk to me about the process of what you learned through those 2 years of research and sort of mapping the idea maze towards what became Last Energy.
Yeah, I mean, it took a year before I felt comfortable saying anything controversial, because I just always was thinking, even though like the answer seemed pretty obvious, I was always just in my head thinking, I don't know enough. There's something I'm missing here. But then I gave a talk at Oak Ridge about a year in to summarize some of my learnings. And that was the first forum that I said something controversial. Mostly about like this, the meltdowns not being a bad thing. And a few other things too, starting to like critique the nuclear industry for its problems instead of blaming outside industries. And people started getting up and clapping. Like, I couldn't believe it. I thought I was going to get booed out of the room, have stuff thrown at me. And people literally stood up one at a time and started clapping. And one person, voiced an opinion. They said out loud, like you were saying, the thing that we've always known, but nobody is like, okay, saying out loud. And I feel like I'm just like complimenting myself here, but this was like a really pivotal moment of validation. And that expression, you can't get someone to understand something when they're paid not to. That was essentially the encapsulation of that idea, is like all of their jobs. Anyone who's an expert in nuclear, their job is like literally their livelihood, their family, like putting food on the table for their family is tied to towing the line of the existing nuclear narrative, which is designed not to sell new plants, but to sell fear. And so it was very refreshing for them to hear this outsider opinion. And that gave me all the confidence I needed to refine that message for the next couple of years to come.
So what does it feel like inside the nuclear industry now? Are there people who are clinging tightly to that kind of fear-mongering business model and people who are like, hell yeah, let's build?
Well, there's like this whole new component to, let's say not the industry, but like the sector of like all of these advocacy groups. And they're incredible. And I can take zero credit for anything they're doing. They're like creating these like global movements. Like this guy like Mark Nelson, and then there's others. A lot of them came out of like the school of Schellenberger. And they are.
We had Mark Nelson on this podcast.
Yeah. Oh my God! I should have done my research.
Dude,
okay, I'm going to go back and listen.
I want to have Chris Kiefer on too.
Chris
he's hilarious
is the man.
also. Yeah.
It's so funny. Chris and I, I feel like Chris is one of my best friends, even though we actually hadn't met in person. We've known each other for 2 years. I mean, I literally listen to this guy when I go to sleep because it's like spending your time listening to a podcast. And then he listens to my podcast. So we had this like whole like relationship without like actually being like, we had this like asynchronous relationship, which is just like so weird. But so I've always felt like, and I just feel like I know him and he's such a good guy and what he's doing is incredible and he's so smart and hardworking. It's just like incredible dude. And then finally got a chance to meet him in real life. And it was as if we had known each other the whole time, which, we met for the first time 2 years in. It was crazy.
Yeah. Will you give like a 30-second background on Chris? Just for people who want to look him up and follow him, because I think he's hilarious, but you'll explain him better than I will.
Yeah. So his platform is called the Decouple Podcast, and his background is he's an emergency room physician. So like he's got, and I think it's super cool and super key that he has this like unimpeachable credibility. A lot of others, when they're super pro-nuclear, are just simply accused as being like stooges for the industry, unfairly, but it's like almost impossible to overcome that. But he wears his like medical badge, like around like to these conferences. Like he's like a real doctor, like saving lives in an emergency room as his day job, and just does this out of the passion of like wanting to do good for the world. And so people are almost forced to take him more seriously, and it has an incredible impact. I mean, he's been able to like make movements at the highest levels of government in Canada as just like some guy, not some guy, but like some guy who's a doctor and has a podcast, and like now like the prime minister like listens to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, or actually, I'm not sure which of the ministers. Like, there's ministers that listen to him. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, there's some hilarious videos of him like rolling into Parliament or whatever Canada calls its Congress, with like this amazing mustache and just being like chilling out and being like, guys, nuclear's rad. I have the floor for 5 minutes. Let me explain like in small words how important this is. It's just hilarious.
Yeah. And Nelson's got the mustache too, occasionally at least.
I don't know what it is with you guys. Yeah. Maybe you should grow a mustache. I don't know.
I had one when I started. I feel like I should get a little credit for that, but I haven't had one, and it looks a little too goofy to be in a professional setting, so I haven't had one for years.
Yeah, something about that nuclear '80s like throwback mustache.
That's right. It's like a throwback.
Yeah. So, how did you decide? Okay, so picking up from sort of finding your feet with like resonance in the nuclear industry, how did you go from I'm just trying to learn to I think I got my head around like a business model or an opportunity that isn't being tackled? Like, how did you decide what form Last Energy should take when you started this company?
Well, so yeah, I spent that year of like just learning, and then a year of being invited to like keynote all these events. And so I had this like forum now to like test out my thesis and get a lot of feedback from like thousands of people. And I put the videos up online. I get back, from like even like global communities. And I use that to essentially, tell everyone what our strategy was for Last Energy over the course of a year and get feedback. And at the end of that year, it felt like and I was also actually, man, I forget this sometimes, but I really did not want to start another startup at the time because I just done that. It was like so brutal, like personally, it's just like so brutal. Yeah. So, and I just come out of one and I was like, I don't want to do that again. But yeah, I was telling everyone what to do and nobody was listening. And so I just at some point did it myself.
What's the it?
The it is don't reinvent the reactor. Just take the existing standard reactor, shrink it down, reduce the risk. Like, you don't even have to reduce the cost on paper. You just have to reduce the risk of cost overruns in reality. So it's like pretty simple. So just do that and you're going to have the cheapest, cleanest energy mankind has ever seen. And either people refuse to believe that it's that simple or they're incentivized not to follow that path, but that's what we're doing.
It seems so simple when you put it that way. So like, what is special about this approach?
I mean, I like to say we're innovative in how uninnovative we are. Like, we are not introducing material science, chemistry, fuel, physics, supply chain risk. We're just not doing that. Like if you just look at the existing nuclear installations, they're already the cheapest power mankind has ever produced. Like, you can look historically and look at their build costs and their build schedule. Like, nothing to this day beats a 1968 nuclear power plant. And it produces baseload power, it produces, dispatchable power, it produces clean power, power with energy security. Every characteristic, if you wanted to write down what you want out of a power system, a 1968 nuclear reactor does it. So just like try to get as close to that as possible. And yeah, that's our thesis.
And then to just build a shitload of them as quick as you can.
Yeah. And then you get the cost down even more. I mean, like we're going to demonstrate a world where not only energy is clean, but energy is 10 times or eventually maybe even 100 times cheaper than it is today. And that's energy abundance. That's not just clean energy and reduction of air pollution. That's the end of poverty as we know it for the entire globe. Like, what could be cooler than that?
Yeah, something I really like to, I want to write a post about this eventually, but I'm still kind of like collecting ideas. Like, what happens when energy is too cheap to meter? When it's, 100 or 1,000 times cheaper? What are all of the things that change in the world? Like, I think that's such an insane, fun, beautiful question.
It is so cool. And yeah, I highly encourage you to do that so I can start including those examples in my speech. Because like I try to think about it and I've got like these ideas in my head, but it's going to be a little bit of like art to make sure that you're communicating the idea in a way that is both visionary but seems achievable. So yeah, send me that list when you get it. Jason Crawford, who hosted that conference that we were talking about that we met at, he's also like into that question as well. So he's another good person to ask.
Yeah, I would love to talk to Jason. I had Josh Stores Hall on the podcast also,
Oh
who
yeah.
wrote "Where's My Flying Car," and he goes through a handful of them in there. Examples in that book, but like desalinization is one that like basically fresh water is abundant if energy is sufficiently cheap.
Yeah, so roll with me on that one for a second. Like, can we take that one step deeper? So let's say that we have unlimited clean water everywhere. What are some of the other things that we can do with it other than just like providing clean drinking water? Like, can we change the weather by like spraying it into the air in key times and key places? Like,
I
maybe.
mean,
All right. Like,
yeah, big. I mean, it's a big input to abundance of food. Is it fresh water? Um,
yeah,
you
maybe
can
that
have
means the end of war because how much of war is based off of like being able to like grow your crops where you need them when you need them.
yeah. I mean, war, the scarcity, the main modes of scarcity, right? Energy, water, food, like
Yeah.
the things that drive people to kill generally.
And like trees are like food for buildings. So that means like structural materials become cheaper too, right?
Yep, structural materials. Actually, just Alex Bridgman sent me a post this morning, a little clip of something, and I'm not going to be able to articulate the science in between, but there's basically a startup that's changing. It has a new method of producing steel where energy is the main input. And they're like excited about that because as energy costs come down, steel becomes massively cheap. Another like super critical sort of building input.
So I would actually take that one step further. Like I would start with that and I would say, what is better than steel that doesn't exist as a structural material because the energy input is even a higher percentage of its total cost? And like the thing that would come to me are like specialty plastics. Like there's a plastic that's in like firemen's helmets that I know just from research at one point that is like stronger than steel and 10 times lighter.
Oh,
Like, and obviously, so it's like a plastic, so it sequesters carbon. So like, imagine if you just built all buildings out of that plastic, you'd sequester carbon, everything would be lighter, cheaper, better, easier, and that would just, and energy would enable that, right?
yeah. That's amazing. I mean, if electric cars are prolific, transportation gets way cheaper. Yeah.
Let's go beyond cars. Like maybe if energy is so much
Trains,
cheaper,
planes.
yeah, like these little personal quadcopter things, like it could really take off. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I know somebody working on farming robots that's very driven by entirely electric components. So yeah, and manufacturing increasingly like electricity is the main input too. Yeah. So all that to say, we should definitely really, really worry about energy getting cheaper.
Focus on it. Not worry about it. Focus on it.
Focus on it. Yes. Thank you. Good reframe. Okay. So Last Energy sells whole ass power plants. Who do you sell those to?
Yeah, so we actually don't sell the power plants. We design, build, own, and operate the power plants, and we sell long-term electricity contracts to our customers.
Okay.
And those customers are heavy industrial energy users, such as glass, aluminum, cement, pulp and paper, steel, chemicals like ammonia, automotive manufacturing, battery manufacturing. That's a list of some of our early customers right there.
Interesting. So these are like people, big companies who own factories who want their own power source directly.
Yep.
Interesting. It's not even necessarily that governments are buying them or that utilities are adding them to the grid, anything like that. How many of your plants are actually connected to the grid?
Oh, our first one will come online in 2025, but we've sold a couple dozen already.
And talk to me about you said something in there about mitigating. There's a long list of risks you were avoiding taking on. And one of them you listed, and there was a supply chain.
Yeah, so a lot of those factor into supply chain. So yeah, so anytime you make a change to chemistry, material science, fuel, or physics, the cascading effect that it has on destandardizing your supply chain, forcing each of those components to become, I mean, even simple components such as like valves or tanks or regulators or compressors or turbines, each one of those now becomes $1 billion R&D project just to integrate into a system that has a fundamentally different chemistry. And so, yeah, I always say, I believe that your reactor physics will work. I believe your system will work, no problem. But like your supply chain now is going to be 10 times as hard to procure. and more expensive, have a higher, failure rate a decade out. Like it'll take a decade for you to realize that your corrosion rates are just slightly off than what you thought they were. That means your capacity factor 10 years out will go down, and your impact on your energy price is driven up now because of that. So it's like, yeah, those are not challenges I would want to take on.
So you're using entirely existing parts.
Yep. Essentially, we have a rule: every single component that goes in our power plant has to be operating in 100 power plants around the world.
And you haven't found any components that haven't been able to meet that yet?
Nope. So, I mean, a nuclear plant, a standard light water reactor nuclear plant, is like the simplest possible thing you can imagine. You've got a thermal power plant, and there's tens of thousands of those and all the components that goes in those. And then your hot rock is essentially a pressure vessel, and nuclear fuel bundles, which are also produced by the tens of thousands. I mean, most people don't realize those same fuel bundles provide 10% of world electricity today. 10% of world electricity. So those are fairly common too. So everything is pretty simple. That's the whole point. Make it simple, and don't run away with too many good ideas.
Yeah. How long does it take? So you said the first one's going online 2025.
That's the target. It might take longer, but that's what we're targeting.
When did that process start then?
In many ways, it started 4 years ago. I mean, a big part of this is getting through the regulations. And I started meeting with regulators 4 years ago to really understand, which regulators are capable of conducting a good licensing process, and spending time with them, helping them get up to speed on the concept. And a lot of it's credibility building. A lot of what a nuclear regulator does isn't just assess your design; it assesses your company. So it started 4 years ago, and we'll take a few more years till the first one comes online.
Where's that one going to be?
Could be in Poland or Romania or the United Kingdom. Those are the three markets that we're pursuing as early markets.
Okay. So you haven't been able to start construction yet?
We actually built them in Texas, but then we ship them in pieces to the target markets and do final assembly on site. So we don't actually have to know where the first plant is going to go to already start working on it.
That's super cool. So I mean, there's these kind of like prefab construction. Is that a reasonable analogy?
That's exactly right. We go to shops that on the outside say prefab construction, and we say, here are the schematics, go build us this. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Oh, I mean, another way to sort of, de-risk. And they're all like standard parts, right? Just walls and doors and...
Everything that is built for our plant has been built in hundreds of plants already. It's just our specific configuration. I mean, in many ways, I'm downplaying the technical input to this. Like, you could say the same thing about almost any product that exists. Like a smartphone is a collection of, hundreds of components that are off-the-shelf components used. The chips are used in other things and were already. And then the job of Apple or Samsung, it's still a lot of technical work, but to design a configuration of how it comes together and into a product that they can then sell. And we, in many ways, just do the same thing. We are the systems integrators of components in a unique form factor that we productize and market and sell around the world.
And then continue to service, right? So it is Last Energy staff that's managing these plants, securing these plants, operating.
And for that, we typically partner with local power plant operations companies that obviously speak the language and already have the staff ready to go. And then they just plug into our facility just like they would, a modern natural gas facility that would be built. Okay,
interesting. So you're kind of the, if you're the general contractor or like the accountable party for it, you're hiring a local contractor to...
We're like a step above, the general contractor. We're more like the owner's engineer, and then the labor is usually done by subcontracted companies.
Interesting. I mean, I guess that makes sense if the requirements and stuff are different in each implementation, because you'll have plants all around the world.
And it's more scalable. I mean, these power plant operations businesses, their business is to hire power plant operators. Mm-hmm. Our business is to design a scalable energy revolution.
Yeah, it's a good tagline. Let's talk about the waste a little bit, because it normally stays on site for plants, and that's something that I feel like even people who are like relatively curious and open-minded about still view this as like a big problem, or blocker to like nuclear adoption.
Yeah, it is their perception problem. It is not a safety or technical issue. And quite frankly, for most people who have a problem with it, like it's not their problem, because like they're not living in a community where anyone is proposing to build this. They're just talking about it. But no, I mean, listen, nuclear waste has never hurt a single person, place, or thing in all of human history. So the idea that nuclear waste is dangerous is insane. But once again, if your 5 closest friends and everyone you know always said nuclear waste is the most hazardous thing on planet Earth, I can't fault you for believing that. But yeah, it's just not true.
But please change your mind and vote nuclear.
Yeah. Yeah, listen, I mean, I don't know. I think like as cultural shifts happen and different, cultural divisions throughout society are more pro-nuclear, less pro-nuclear, whatever it is, people will naturally change their opinions to like move with the mass, to move with the herd. And so nothing I can do from a marketing perspective is going to change like the public's opinion, but the public's opinion, will change eventually as these other, social forces come into play.
Have you felt, I mean, you're kind of in the crow's nest to see the winds of some of this change. Have you felt a change in the sort of ambient, like opinion and interest in nuclear over the last decade or so?
Yeah, about 2 years ago, there's a huge change. I don't know where it came from, but it's like all of a sudden it went from, I was like telling people at cocktail parties, like first I'm an energy person, and then like later in the thing say nuclear, and then like that's all changed. Like people are super like, yeah, I mean, I don't know what it is, but like the zeitgeist has shifted. I don't know what caused it, but
interesting.
Years ago, like everyone I know is like, and it's always like, oh, all along I like nuclear. People are always saying like, oh, since I was a kid I like nuclear. I was like, okay, sure. You should have said it a few years ago, but whatever. Cool.
Show me the tweet. Put it in the blockchain. Let me see it. Prove it. So what has been going on? Has that change been reflected in the regulatory at all? I mean, I'm optimistic now that sort of the NRC has approved something.
Nothing. They haven't approved anything. It's crazy. I mean, there's announcements, but it's not true.
Well, they approved a NuScale, right? NuScale's new.
Nope. They got a certificate. I remember the days that I used to get a certificate in elementary school for doing a good job on my homework, but has no legal weight. No, what you need is a license, and they've not issued them a license, and that is still 5 years and $500 million away. And even they would admit the certificate is paper that they wouldn't wipe their ass with.
Is that for the new design that they're proposing? Like, do you also need that license? And that's
we're not going through the NRC for licensing, so I don't know what the certificate nonsense is, but it has zero legal weight.
Because you don't have to go through it because you're not building in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly. The NRC governs domestic facilities, and our facilities are international.
Okay, so you're going to have to at some point, or
not the NRC, no, the local regulator, and yeah, we're going through that process right now. But not any of this certificate bullshit. You're getting a license. Like, you get a license. You want a license? You want to operate a facility? Get a license. Certificate is just like fun to hang on your wall, I guess. I don't know.
I hope that this. I don't know. I want to believe regulators have their heart in the right place.
Well, I mean, listen. The Breakthrough Institute published this incredible article the other day. About what happened. Like, Congress mandated, and once again, I'm going to preface this with, like, I'm sure like the people at the NRC, smart, intelligent, like talking to them, hardworking, well-intentioned. There's an institutional problem though. And so what happened is Congress mandated that they streamline their process for small reactors. And instead of streamlining it, they took all of the existing rules, added 1,200 pages of additional rules, not replacement rules, additional rules you have to follow. And that's where we are today. So how optimistic can you be? But why should you be optimistic? Why do you care if new nuclear gets built in the US first? I don't know why anyone cares. Like, eventually things might change, but like, build it somewhere else first. Like, why does it have to be the US?
Because I live in the US and I want cheap electricity, and I want the US to.
We have cheap electricity. We have cheap electricity.
I want cheaper electricity. I want
Yeah,
electricity too cheap to meter.
Yeah, it's not going to get that cheap because of
Yeah.
like there's other things that you have to worry about, like transmission costs. Like when PG&E charges, I don't know, 13 cents a kilowatt hour, like the production of electricity was only 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Like it's not going to get that cheap due to the way that like the market incentives are set up in the US. Like that's another problem that has nothing to do with the production of power.
Yeah, the energy markets are an insane thing. Like it's a whole convoluted, wild process unto itself. Like these sort of short-term auctions, long-term auctions, price floors, rebates for different generations. Like it's so complex.
Yeah, no, the US is the absolute worst when it comes to like being able to understand the electricity markets in the US. No human is capable of this. Like, I don't think AI, like, but this ChatGPT stuff is amazing, better than I ever thought it would get. I even think it would crash under the weight of trying to understand the US electricity markets.
Even GPT-3 could not get a license from the NRC.
I'll hold my breath for GPT-7 to like figure this out. Yeah.
Okay, so how do you see the next 50 years playing out in the energy industry and nuclear in particular?
Well, I mean, I think no matter what, not just 100%, but 10x today's energy production, 1,000% will someday be entirely driven by nuclear. Yeah, you might make chemical fuels out of nuclear and then ship those chemical fuels around the world, but it is an inevitability. At some point, we might have to have civilization collapse and rebuild itself. But when some future alien civilization comes here and sees, what we're driving our energy off of as a root source, it will be nuclear, no doubt. So I don't know. I think it could happen much faster. I think it could happen in 20 years, 30 years, have a total energy revolution. And maybe it takes 150 years, but eventually it will be 100% nuclear.
It does seem like something approaching the logical end state, right? Like Steve Jurvetson talks about this stuff all the time. He's like, what do you consider inevitable over a very long arc?
Yeah.
So
that's a great way to think about things. Yeah.
I think and I've heard him say, like, there's 3 that I have high conviction about, which is all cars will be electric, all cars will be autonomous, and his third is we will no longer raise and kill animals for meat. I
don't know about a few of those.
I mean, it's a good frame of question, but I think your frame on like almost all, I think, something approaching like no fossil fuels or entirely nuclear power is a reasonable thing to think about in that frame. Yeah,
I definitely feel that way. And I think all cars will be autonomous eventually, but electric and the meat thing, I'm just not so sure. I think that, and that's one of the problems with Silicon Valley, and one of the reasons I had to leave in 2017 was there was just too much bubble thinking. Yeah. And I think how people feel about their relationships with animals, you would believe the whole world feels that it is totally inhumane to kill an animal if you lived in Silicon Valley. But there are fundamental cultural differences in other places that would not lead you to that same inevitability, because there's really a moral question in addition to a technical one, and people have a very different moral lens on that.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, there's a big, broad world out there, and lots of different people live in a lot of different ways. What is your? I noticed you did not say a mix of renewables and nuclear, and that felt deliberate.
Yeah, I just don't. I mean, listen, I emotionally love renewables. My first job was at a solar, a Frontier Tech solar company, thin film solar panels, nanosolar. I love it. I love the way that wind turbines look, and I love the machinery in them. And I think it's just so cool. And especially the ocean-based platforms of Olympus, I think it's so cool. But from a practical perspective, it doesn't really make sense. The energy is so dilute. The distribution of that energy is intermittent. These are fundamental principles. And then there's the carbon footprint too. If you are using 1,000 times as much material to produce the same amount of energy, all material has a carbon footprint no matter what way you cut it. And so, I mean, there's a lot of fishy accounting right now in carbon footprints, but even the most strong advocates of renewables will still admit that they have a carbon footprint. They'll just erase that in the marketing literature, but they won't dispute the fact. Mm-hmm. And so you're adding more carbon to the air, maybe not at the same rate as fossil fuels, but if what you like about renewables is that they don't produce carbon, you are wrong. and you should re-question that assumption. And if we keep adding more carbon, then we're not removing carbon. And this whole goal of net zero is just totally ridiculous as well. We will have increasing climate impacts, not just going to net zero, but unless we go drastically net negative. And if your carbon footprint for renewables is too high to achieve that negative rate, boy, oh boy, like it almost doesn't matter what you do. It's just a matter of maybe slowing down climate change by a couple of years, but you should really look at yourself in the mirror if you think that's your goal.
Yeah, that was another thing that I wrote down when I was listening to some of your talks, and you were thumping the podium with this amazing line: if climate change is going to be solved, it will be entirely through nuclear.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think that's, that's kind of you went rationale before takeaway, but I think that was your argument for that statement, right?
Yeah, I have a bunch of YouTube. I used to do like these university circuits, and so I've got a ton of YouTube videos that like walk through that line of reasoning very carefully. It usually takes me about like 20 minutes to like build up to the point, where that is indisputable. But yeah, that's the takeaway.
Cool. Is there anything else? Like, I know that this is a frustratingly summarizing question to ask somebody who has given hours and hours of talks about nuclear. But what are some of the things, that you wish everyone knew?
I want people to think of nuclear as beautiful. Mm-hmm. I'm not like a woo-woo person, but I do mean like beautiful architecturally, but also beautiful spiritually, beautiful in terms of like its impact on human prospects and human flourishing. And so I want to create that world where people think nuclear is beautiful.
It is fucking magic. It is a staggering thing that something smaller, almost smaller than we can conceive, has bonded together in a way that we can separate those bonds and unleash millions of times the energy that comes from this like inert little thing that's smaller than we can conceive. Is an absolute miracle. The fact that we are not, all of our lives haven't been radically transformed over the last 100 years by that realization is like,
I know. We'll eventually get there. It is so awesome. I mean, it's like, what's more powerful than a sun or a star? I should say, what's more powerful than a star? An exploding star. And nuclear, like uranium that we break apart is literally like the bonded battery remnants of an exploded star. I mean, it's just so cool.
Yeah, that's incredible. Can people without domain-specific backgrounds get jobs in and be productive in nuclear companies and the nuclear industry?
Totally. We almost have a rule of not hiring. I mean, other than like for the nuclear systems themselves, we don't hire anyone from the nuclear industry, almost as a rule at our company.
Interesting. You have a ton of open roles. I was going through the careers page today. There's a lot of stuff.
We're growing fast. We got like $5 billion worth of electricity contracts to fulfill. So,
oh my God, what's like the stage and status of Last Energy right now?
Yeah, I mean, we're an early stage venture-backed company, but this last year we just had so much commercial traction that now it's just a matter of like grow.
That's awesome. What an exciting time, man.
Yeah.
Congrats. This is I'm so glad that you picked up the sword and shield that you walked around yelling at people to, like, it's so funny. Like, do it. This is how you move your industry forward, and nobody did it. And you just eventually sighed and you're like, fuck it. Like, here we go again.
That's perfect. That's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, thank you for saving the world. I appreciate you, being willing to go fight the battles and bring us into a more beautiful nuclear future.
Thank you. Thank you for your time as well.